Okay, hi everybody. Um, Today I want to give you a little lecture on J.L. Mackie, who was on the syllabus for this week and who we did not cover in class. Um, this is an important paper, so you really want to take some notes on this. We'll talk about it a little at the beginning of class next week, but I want to say a few things about it now to make sure that you understand it going into next week. Mackie. This is probably the most famous paper written in the 20th century on the problem of evil. Um, but almost no one thinks it's right, fundamentally. A few people think it's right, but most people tend to think it makes a mistake. But it's an important paper anyway, and we read it anyway because whether and why it makes that mistake, thinking about the problem he gives you, sort of gives you a way of thinking about how the problem of evil works. So this is the same problem, the problem of evil, that we were talking about last class on Monday, R.E. Dostoevsky. They're talking about the same problem. But Mackie is concerned with the logic of it. If you remember that lecture, I told you that there were different ways to frame the problem, and one of them we call the logical problem of evil. That is what Mackie is defending in this paper. He's defending the idea that evil is a logical problem for the existence of God. Other people have thought that as well, but that term and that idea, the language of it really starts with this paper by J.L. Mackie. So what do we mean when we say that evil might be a logical problem? Well, Mackie says right here on the first page, if you have the 7th edition of the book, it'll be on page 256. If you've got the 6th edition, it's on page 299. Most of the most important stuff in this paper happens on the first page, that first big section leading up to section A. In the introduction, he frames the problem, and we're going to focus most of our attention right on that first page. We'll talk about some other things in a minute. But when he says that the problem of evil is a logical problem, let's let him say it. It's right in the second paragraph. In the second paragraph, he says, quote, "The problem of evil, in the sense I shall be using the phrase, is a problem only for someone who believes that there is a God who is both omnipotent and wholly good, and it is a logical problem, the problem of clarifying and reconciling a number of beliefs. It's not a scientific problem that might be solved by further observation, or a practical problem that might be solved by a decision or an action." So the problem of evil, as he wants to frame it, is not the question of what you should do in the face of evil. It is not a question that we might discover the answer to scientifically or by hearing the right words someday. It's a logical problem, which he calls a problem of reconciling your beliefs. So, for instance, if you believe that John is taller than Joe and Joe is taller than John, you have a logic problem. It's not a scientific mistake because you don't have to observe the situation to find out whether you've made a mistake. If John is taller than Joe, then Joe can't be taller than John. Those two beliefs don't go together, right? So when he says the problem of evil is a logical problem, he's saying that there are beliefs about God and about evil that don't fit together, like believing that something is a triangle and a square at the same time doesn't fit together. And that's what this paper is really about. And that's what people, when they talk about Mackie and this problem, are concerned with trying to figure out whether he's right to say that the problem of evil is a logical contradiction of some kind. Okay? So, What's his point? His big point you find in the first paragraph. If you go back there now, read the first paragraph, you will see him saying essentially the following things. It is one thing, he says, to have, to point out that an argument for the existence of something doesn't work. So you might say there's no good argument for the existence of Santa Claus. We don't have any proof that there's a Santa Claus. But that would be different than having an argument against Santa Claus. It'd be a very different thing to have a proof that there is no X. So, the arguments for the existence of God, by this he means the ones we've talked about, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, they have been criticized, and many people think they don't work. Some people think they do work. We've already talked about that. But he wants to say, it's one thing to say that we have no proof that there is a God. It'd be a very different thing to think we have some proof that there's not one. And when he says that the problem of evil is a logical problem for the existence of God, he's trying to claim that too. He's trying to claim that evils can somehow be proof that God is not good or something. That's something we'll hold off on for a second. In fact, we'll get to it right now. The third paragraph. In the third paragraph, you have him framing the problem, and this is where it gets tricky, because once he tries to lay out the problem, he has to say more than he thinks he has to say to prove that there's a contradiction here. So that's what I want us to think about. Is there a contradiction that he finds in these premises? So, paragraph 3. In its simplest form, he says the problem of evil, is this. God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. Okay, so I wrote this out for us. Ignore the bottom part for now. There's the bottom part down here. We'll get there in a minute. God is omnipotent. God is wholly good. Evil exists. He wants to say that if any two of these are true, the third one will be false. So if God is all-powerful, so he could eliminate evil, but evil exists, then he must not be good, because if he were good, he would eliminate evil since he can. So if 1 and 3 are true, 2 is false. What about 2 and 3? Maybe God is good, but evil exists. So if God is good and evil exists, he must not be able to prevent it, because he would want to. He's good. If he's good, but evil exists, then he's not omnipotent. What about 1 and 2? What if God is omnipotent and perfectly good? Well, then he'd want to eliminate evil because he's good, and he'd be all-powerful, so he could. And if you both want to and can do a thing, you do it. So evil would not exist. So if 1 and 2 are true, 3 is false. But he wants to say, we know 3 is true. We can see this one in the world around us. So if that's right, and we know that 3 is true, that there's evil in the world, one of these two has to go. Now it could be 1, it could be 2. Either one might be true alone, but they can't be true together, he says. That's the logical problem, as he frames it. But I want us to think about this. He knows that that's not enough to show there's a contradiction in these beliefs. Let's read on then to the next paragraph, the 4th paragraph. It starts, however. So, however, he says, the contradiction does not arise immediately. To show it, we need some additional premises, or perhaps some quasi-logical rules connecting the terms good, evil, and omnipotent. We'll get there in a second, what those additional premises are. But let's start with that, the contradiction does not arise immediately. Okay, let's talk about what a contradiction is. A contradiction is when you say that something is true and false at the same time. It's a very specific thing. Things can seem contradictory without really being contradictory. They can be paradoxical or whatever without really having the form of a contradiction. A contradiction says A is true and not true. So if you believe that elves exist but you also believe that they don't, that's a contradiction. And we should look at this problem again and see why he says the contradiction does not arise immediately. For you to have a contradiction here, an explicit, real contradiction, you'd have to say that one of these three things is true and false at the same time. So you need to say God is omnipotent and he's not. Or evil exists but it really doesn't exist. That's a contradiction. So if there is a logical problem with these three, then one of the three needs to be said true and false too at the same time. Now, when he says there seems to be one, well, there does seem to be one. If you say that God is all-powerful and evil exists, then it seems that God is not good, and God is not good and God is good are contradictory. But to really do that, you need a few more assumptions. You need the last things he says in this introduction. So go back to that last fourth paragraph. He says, these additional principles are, 1, that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. If you look at that again, read it slowly and carefully, he says that these are quasi-logical rules or additional premises. A premise is the support of an argument. A logic rule is something else altogether, but he seems to mean that this is just what these words mean. Omnipotence means you can do anything. Fair enough. Nobody really quibbles with that one. Good means opposed to evil, he says. So if a good thing can eliminate evil, it would, because that's part of what the word good means. Such is his story. That's his argument. So let's think about that. If good does mean that it would eliminate evil, if that's part of what it means for a thing to be good, then we have this bigger argument. A minute ago it was just these three things, but really it's 5. God is omnipotent, God is good. If good means that a thing would eliminate evil, and if omnipotent means that a thing can do anything, then God would want to eliminate evil because he's good. God would be able to because he's omnipotent. So if 1 and 2 were true, and these were true, these were what 1 and 2 mean, then there would be no evil. Now we have a really logical argument. Now you have explained what your words mean, and the argument would work something like this. If 1 and 3 were true, and these 2 things were true, add that up in your head for a second. I'm going to stop talking. God is omnipotent. This is what omnipotence means. But evil exists. A good thing would eliminate evil as far as it could. So if evil exists, then he hasn't eliminated it. He could eliminate it, so he must not be good. If 1 and 3 are true, and these are true, 2 is false, and you do get a contradiction now. You could take 2 other ones. You could take 2 and 3. God is good, evil exists, a good thing would eliminate evil, but if evil exists and there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, then God must not be omnipotent, because if he were good, he would eliminate evil, and it's there. So, this is the way the contradiction works. This is the way the logical problem of evil works in a nutshell. 1, 2, and 3 cannot all be true at the same time if, this is a big if, these 2 things are also true. So if these 2 things are true, then one of these three things has to go logically. That's the logical problem of evil in a nutshell. I'm going to repeat that last part. These three things are contradictory only if both of these are true. Now, he tosses those out at the end of the introduction, and then he never really talks about them again. He says it's just what the word good means, it's what the word omnipotent means. But these are the question marks. If these aren't true, or if they're not necessarily true, or if we don't know whether they're true, then we don't know whether these three are contradictory. So when he says this is a logical problem, what we should say is that it might be a logical problem if we know these two things. Now let's talk about these two things. The second one is pretty much universally, everybody agrees with it. It's just what omnipotence means. Omnipotence means you can do anything. There are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. Fair enough. We will look a little later at what omnipotence means in a little more detail, but that doesn't seem to be the problem here for the problem of evil. The question seems to be about this one. A good thing eliminates evil as far as it can. Now, if this is true and this is true, one of these has to go. And we know that this is here, so one of these would have to go. So a lot hangs on thinking about whether this is true or not. His defense, and it's a pretty good defense, is that it's just what good means. Good and evil are opposed to each other. A good thing would want an evil thing to stop happening, he says. But he knows, and you should know, that many, many, many people in the history of philosophy have denied this, and not just denied it, have argued against it, have tried to give theodicies. Remember that word from Monday? A theodicy is an argument that God would let evil happen for some good reason. It's a defense of the reasons God might have for eliminating evil. So if a theodicy is true, this is false. If this is true, all those theodicies are false. So this is a big question. It's not something we can just sort of say in an introduction and then move on from. We'd have to really think about this. And he knows that, so that's why the paper keeps going for a while. The rest of this paper is really about that idea. So if you look forward in the paper, you'll see two big sections. The next section of the paper, A, is titled Adequate Solutions. And in that section, he is defending a pretty straightforward idea. The way to solve this problem is to deny one of these three things. He's ignoring these. He's saying, we know that this is what good means, we know this is what omnipotence means. He might be wrong about that, but he's ignoring this and saying the real way to solve this problem is to just drop one of these three things. If you, like Alexander Pope, don't believe that evil is real, it's an illusion or something, you don't have a problem. If you don't believe that God is good, maybe you believe he's all-powerful, but you don't believe he's really good, he's just in charge, you don't have a problem. If you believe, like there was a famous rabbi who thought this, that God is good, but unable anymore to meddle in our affairs, he's just distant and not in charge, but good and cares about us, then you don't have a problem. If God can't eliminate evil, it makes sense that it would exist. If God doesn't want to eliminate it, it would make sense that it exists. So the problem goes away if one of these three things goes away. And he's right about that. Mackie said one way to solve this problem is to say one of these three things is wrong. And you don't have a logical problem. But what everyone does instead, if they're interested in defending God anyway, would be to attack this QL1, this a good thing always eliminates evil. And for that, we turn to B. his quote-unquote, the section is called fallacious solutions, meaning solutions that are fallacies, that contain a logic mistake. He thinks if you follow this argument so far, you know that any attempt to explain how God and evil go together must be wrong. We know they must be wrong because here we have a proof of it, so he says. So I want, last thing with Mackie, to look at some of his responses to these fallacious that's just a word for mistaken logically. Fallacious solutions. There are 4 of them. Now I want to say this as clearly as I can. When you read through here, if you go to page 258 in the 7th edition, or page 301 in the older 6th edition, you will see the beginning of a series of theodicies. They're numbered, like number 1, good cannot exist without evil, or evil is necessary as a counterpart to good. Okay? Every one of those is something Mackie is trying to prove false. I have seen this on exams in this kind of class over and over again, where people will say, Mackie says good cannot exist without evil. That is not right. Mackie is trying to prove that idea wrong. Okay? So every one of these, there are 4 of them. If you look starting there, you'll see good cannot exist without evil. Number 2 on the next page, evil is necessary as a means to good. 3, the universe is better with evil in it. 4, evil is due to human free will. Mackie doesn't believe any of those. And 50% of the time, someone will, write on an exam, Mackie believes that evil is due to human free will. He doesn't. He's presenting his opponent's views so that he can respond to them. Okay? So I'll say that again as clearly as possible. Mackie doesn't think evil is due to human free will. Mackie thinks evil shouldn't exist if God is good. And he's trying to show what mistake this makes. Okay, so every one of these 4 is something he's trying to prove false. That should be obvious if you read it, but people tend to read that backwards, so I'm sort of stressing that. He's trying to prove these 4 things wrong. The first 2 are easy. The first 2 of these theodicies, they're fallacious. He calls them fallacious solutions, but really they're just theodicies. He's trying to prove them wrong. What is wrong with the first 2? Well, they're easy. He says that they smuggle in the idea that God's not really omnipotent. If good cannot exist without evil, then God can't make good without evil, and so God's not all-powerful. Same with number 2. Evil is necessary as a means to good. Evil makes good happen. Same idea. It means that there's something God can't do. God can't make good without using evil to make it. If that's true, then you have subtly and sneakily denied number 1. That's what he thinks every theodicy really does. Every theodicy, in a sneaky way, will take one of these 2 things back. It will say, God is good and God is all-powerful, but God can't make you can't make good without evil. Well, if he can't make good without evil, he's not really omnipotent. Okay? So, evil can't exist without good. It takes back one of the things you're supposed to say about God, that God is all-powerful. Numbers 3 and 4, though, are a little sneakier. 3, and I want to spend more time on those than on the first 2. The first 2 are easy. They mean that God's not omnipotent, and so they don't really solve the problem. 3, though. The universe is better with some evil in it. Like, evil makes the universe better somehow. That's different than saying 1 or 2. 1 or 2 is saying God can't make good unless he makes evil too. 3 is a little bit different. It says that if you want to make the best world, it will have evil in it. So part of good is evil in some way. Now, why would anyone think this? If you read through here, you will see him talk about first order and second order goods and first and second order evils. Let me explain that really quickly. Mackie is talking about utilitarianism, which we talked about in class the other day, consequentialism. Suppose you think that the basic good and bad things in the world are happiness and unhappiness, or pleasure and pain. So you could just try to make a world with as much happiness in it and as little suffering as possible. That would be a world with as much first order good. First order good is the basic good you're trying to achieve, and as little first order evil as possible. Amounts to saying you want as much happiness and as little unhappiness as possible. And we don't live in that world, but the theodicy might say that happiness and unhappiness are not the only things that matter. There are second order, quote unquote, goods, things like courage and strength and sympathy, that you can only have with unhappiness in the world. So courage is not happiness, but courage is the ability to face unhappiness in a strong, brave way. And you can't really have it. You can't have some of those higher order goods, like love for your neighbor and so on. Some of those might not be able to exist unless there was suffering in the world. So, if you summarize all that, you have something in this number 3 like the greater good theodicy. Evil actually makes the world better because it makes some good things possible that you couldn't have without it. You couldn't have courage without danger. You couldn't have sympathy without suffering. So, evil might exist because it makes those things possible. Our virtues, our love for our neighbors, our moral strength. And that's a plausible case. It's like as good an explanation as you're likely to get for why evil might exist. It makes human morality possible. We'll talk about that in class next week. We're going to talk about a very famous version of that theodicy from Leibniz. So next week we'll talk about this. But Mackie's response to this idea is pretty straightforward. He says for every virtue, every moral, he calls these second order goods, but you can think of that as just like virtues, like kindness. In the face of pain, pain makes kindness possible, but it also makes cruelty possible. That's his problem with the greater good theodicy. Evil makes some good things possible, but it also makes some more bad things possible. If there's suffering in the world, then humans might respond to it with kindness, or they might respond to it with cruelty. And if we look at the history of the world, there's no guarantee that there's going to be more good than bad in the face of evil. Evil might make the world worse. That last idea might be self-explanatory, but the greater good theodicy says evil actually makes the world better because it makes kindness and courage possible. But it also makes unkindness possible. It makes cruelty. It makes evil, human evil, possible. I don't know which side is the better of that argument, but he says 2 things about it. 1, we don't know that it works. And 2, it seems to imply that God is not really good in the sense that he would eliminate evil, because he seems to be allowing it for some reason. So he thinks it implicitly takes back the idea that God is really good if he's allowing evil to exist. So 2 parts of that. He thinks it doesn't work, and it takes back God's goodness. The 4th one is really strange. The 4th one is the free will theodicy. And again, this is something we're going to talk about next week. It's a complicated, really complicated story. But Mackie has an interesting thing to say about this. I want us to remember this next week when we talk about free will, because free will, even when you're not talking about God, is a complicated idea. It means a lot of different things. We'll talk about it. But what does Mackie think about the free will defense? The free will defense says evil might exist even if God is good, because God is not in charge of evil. Evil is not due to God, it is due to us. So God could be perfectly good even if evil exists because he didn't cause it, essentially, just allowed it to happen. There's a lot of questions to ask about this. His focus, you will find on page 261 of the 7th edition, or page 305 in this edition. You may have to hunt around for it, so if you have to pause this and look for it, do so. But the paragraph, the relevant paragraph starts, if it is replied that this objection is absurd. So find that paragraph, if it is replied. The paragraph above it, he asks why God didn't make people with free will who always did right. Okay? So God is all-powerful. He can make anyone he wants. He's all-knowing, so he knows what people are going to do before he makes them. And he's good, so he'd want to make good people. But he made people who would use their free will for evil. Why didn't he make people who would use their free will for good? Okay. Some people may hear that and say, well, he can't make people who would use their free will for so-and-so, because then it wouldn't really be free. This is what Mackie is responding to, that objection I just gave. If it is replied that this objection is absurd, that the making of some wrong choices is logically necessary for freedom, it would seem that freedom must here mean complete randomness or indeterminacy, including randomness with regard to the alternatives good and evil. He's saying you must want free will to mean you behave randomly with no reason at all when you do good rather than evil. In other words, that men's choices and consequent actions can be free only if they are not determined by their characters. Okay. So the free will defense, he says, if it's really going to work, is going to say that your actions are not determined by your character. So what would that mean if your actions were not determined by their character? Would they even be your actions? They'd be random. They wouldn't really come from you. They'd come from nowhere. Why? Only on this assumption, he says, I'm continuing, only on this assumption can God escape the responsibility for men's actions. For, and this is really what I wanted to get to, so find this line. For if he made them as they are, but did not determine their wrong choices, this can only be because the wrong choices are not determined by men as they are. This is the paradox of free will. Free will is a paradoxical idea. It may be true, but it's got a paradox in it. And that is the paradox. I'm going to repeat those lines, and I want you to think about it. If God made us as we are, so let's start with that. If you believe in God, you believe God made you this way. But did not determine what you do, did not determine your wrong choices. So God made you like this, but didn't determine what you do. This can only be true if your choices are not determined by who you are. So you can really only have free will that can't get traced back to God if God made you, but didn't make your actions. But that could only be true if you don't cause your actions, because God made you. So if God made you, but didn't cause your actions, then you didn't cause your actions either. So he says. He's probably right. That is the paradox of free will. Free will seems to mean that your actions can't come from your nature, because if they did come from your nature, then they would be caused and not free. So for you to have free will, it seems to mean that your actions have to be uncaused. They can't be caused by you. They can't be caused by God, because God made you. They can't be caused at all. They have to come from nowhere. And the idea that your actions come from nowhere is a long way from the idea that your actions come from you. It's a messy set of problems. Their free will has a lot of defenders, but in philosophy, the people who defend it are defending that paradox. The paradox is still there, even if you believe in it. So, a lot of people believe in free will of a different kind. They don't believe in a free will that's random. They believe in a free will such that God made you, and you made your actions. So God in some way did make your actions, even if you're free. That's a confusing idea too. But for now, if you didn't catch all the complications of that, I want you to catch it, because we're going to talk about it in class. Go over that again. Listen to it carefully. Read it carefully. There's a deep puzzle about where our actions come from in this. For now, though, what I really want you to get across is the idea that the free will response to the problem of evil has to solve a paradox about where our actions come from. If God made you, but didn't make your actions, then your actions can't really come from you. That's the paradox. So for his money, that means that the idea that you can put God's perfect qualities together with evil with the free will defense doesn't work, because the free will defense doesn't work, basically, because it's got a confusion. God still made you. He is in charge, and he made everything. And he's good, so he should have made a better you. And he could have, because he's all-powerful. So God should have made better beings, because he can and he would want to. Even if he gave us free will, he should have made us better beings who do better things with it. That's his real problem with the free will theodicy. It doesn't really make evil go away. Now, the upshot of this, though, now here's what people tend to say about Mackie now. One of these three things will have to be false if this premise, it's not getting in the camera, there it is, this premise, a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can. If this is true, one of these three things has to be false. But the real response to Mackie is to question this and to present theodicies that try to say that this is wrong. And so Mackie's argument seems to make a mistake in just assuming that this is true, when he really needed to prove this. He needed to prove that good is opposed to evil. He needed to give some kind of moral argument for it or something. But if it even might be wrong, we don't know that these three things really contradict each other until we know this. So that's what we're going to talk about. Do we really know that? Do we know that good is opposed to evil? And so could a theodicy reconcile the two things? Next class, we're going to talk about the most famous theodicy probably since St. Augustine in ancient Rome. The most famous theodicy since then is probably Leibniz's, and we're going to read Leibniz's famous theodicy next class. I guess that's good for today. I'm going to send an email with this, and I'm also going to send you a homework assignment. In that homework assignment, I'm going to want you to describe what the logical problem of evil is in your own words, and tell me why people think it doesn't necessarily work. What does it hang on? What is the big question mark people ask about it? Okay? I will see you